July 14, 1944. A dusty field in Normandy, France. General Omar Bradley, commander of the entire First Army, stands with his arms crossed, watching a single Sherman tank. Welded to its front are 4 crude steel prongs cut from German beach obstacles. The tank crew revs the engine. 30 tons of American steel charges at an ancient earthen wall covered in tangled roots and bushes. The impact is thunderous. Earth explodes. Roots snap like gunfire. And then, the tank bursts through the other side. Belly armor never exposed, frontal armor always facing forward. Bradley turns to his staff officers. How many of these can we make? And how fast? What happened in the next 2 weeks would transform the deadliest campaign of World War II. But the story you're about to hear isn't the legend. It's not about one genius sergeant who single-handedly saved D-Day. The truth is messier, more complicated, and somehow even more remarkable. This is the real story of the hedgerow cutter. And I promise you, the truth is better than the myth. Let me take you back to June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. By the end of that bloody day, Allied forces had established a foothold on 5 Normandy beaches. Casualties were horrific, over 10,000 dead, wounded, or missing. But they'd done it. They were on French soil. The planners back in England had calculated everything. They expected to push 30 miles inland within weeks. They expected to liberate Paris by late summer. They expected mobility, maneuver, the kind of sweeping tank warfare that had defined this conflict. What they got was a medieval nightmare called the bocage. The Norman bocage wasn't just hedges. These were ancient property boundaries that French farmers had built over literally centuries. Earthen berms, walls of compacted dirt, stone, and roots, sometimes 4 feet high, sometimes 15 feet high. And on top of these berms grew dense, tangled masses of trees, bushes, and thorny vegetation. The roots went down 10, 12, sometimes 15 feet into the ground. These things had been growing since before America was even discovered. They were natural fortresses, and they covered Normandy like a maze. Fields were small, sometimes just a few acres each, and every single field was surrounded by these impenetrable walls. For the German defenders, the bocage was a gift from God. Every field became a fortress. Every hedgerow became a defensive position. Machine gun nests, mortar positions, sniper hides, all concealed behind these ancient barriers. But for American tank crews, the bocage became something worse than a battlefield obstacle. It became a killing ground. Here's why. The Sherman tank, America's main battle tank, had thick frontal armor. 3 inches of steel that could stop most German anti-tank weapons. But the belly, the underside of the tank, that was only half an inch to an inch of armor. It had to be thin so the tank wouldn't be too heavy. Now imagine you're a tank commander. You need to cross a hedgerow to get to the next field. The only way to do it is to drive straight at the earthen wall, tilt your tank up as you climb, and expose that paper-thin belly armor to whatever's waiting on the other side. The Germans figured this out immediately. They positioned anti-tank teams, usually with Panzerfausts or Panzerschrecks, shoulder-fired rocket launchers, on the far side of hedgerows. They'd wait and wait, and the moment an American Sherman tilted up to climb over, they'd fire. 1 shot to the belly, 1 dead tank, 5 dead crewmen. The statistics were devastating. The 30th Infantry Division suffered nearly 4,000 casualties in the bocage. The 29th Division took 3,700 casualties. The 35th Division lost 2,500 men. And for all that blood, all that sacrifice, they'd advanced maybe 3 to 7 miles. 3 to 7 miles. In weeks of fighting, General Bradley later called it the most difficult and costly fighting of the war. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel said the bocage gave each German soldier the fighting power of 10 men. The Allied advance had stopped. Not slowed, stopped. And every day that passed meant more casualties, more burned tanks, more young men who'd survived D-Day only to die in some anonymous French field. Something had to change. Someone had to solve the hedgerow problem. Here's where the legend usually tells you about one man, Sergeant Curtis Culin, genius mechanic, came up with the idea in a flash of inspiration. Save the entire campaign single-handedly. That's not what happened. The truth is that by early July 1944, dozens, maybe hundreds, of American soldiers were working on the hedgerow problem. Engineers, tankers, mechanics, infantry officers. Everyone could see the problem. Everyone was trying to solve it. The 79th Infantry Division had developed a hedgerow cutting device by July 5th. The 1990 Corps was experimenting with prongs designed to create holes for explosives. The V Corps had invented something they called brush cutters and green dozers. British engineering units were developing their own solutions, which they'd eventually call prongs. It was a race. Not between armies, but between innovators in the same army. Everyone knew that whoever cracked this problem would change the entire campaign, and in that race, one design would eventually win. But not because it was the only idea, because it was the simplest, the fastest to manufacture, and the most effective. Let me tell you about the man whose name got attached to that design. Curtis Culin III. Born February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he was nobody special. No college degree. No engineering training. He'd worked as a mechanic fixing cars and trucks. The kind of guy who understood machines because he'd spent his life elbow deep in engines, not because he'd studied them in some classroom. When the war came, Culin enlisted in the New Jersey National Guard. He ended up in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron as a tanker. By June 1944, he was a sergeant, 29 years old, a mechanic who happened to be in Normandy watching tanks burn. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, and where the legend falls apart. According to military historian Max Hastings, who's one of the most respected World War II scholars alive, Culin didn't come up with the idea himself. At least not entirely. The actual inspiration came from another soldier, a Tennessee hillbilly that Hastings identifies only as Roberts. Roberts and Culin were talking one day, watching yet another Sherman fail to cross a hedgerow, and Roberts, probably joking, said something like, "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank?" It was a throwaway comment, a joke maybe, but Culin heard it and thought, wait, that could actually work. Here's what makes this story beautiful. Culin could have taken full credit. In the chaos of war, with Roberts probably in a different unit, nobody would have known. But Culin tried, repeatedly, to give Roberts credit for the original idea. He told officers. He mentioned it in reports, it didn't matter. In the publicity that followed, Roberts was forgotten. The invention became the Culin hedgerow cutter, and Curtis Culin, to his credit, seems to have been genuinely uncomfortable with that. But let's talk about what Culin actually did. Because even if the spark of inspiration came from someone else, the execution was all his. The genius of what became known as the Culin Rhino wasn't in its complexity. It was in its brutal simplicity. Culin looked at the hedgerow problem and realized something everybody else had missed. The issue wasn't that you needed to go over the hedgerows. The issue was that you needed to go through them. At ground level, where the belly armor would never be exposed. But how do you punch through 10 to 15 feet of compacted earth, stone, and centuries-old root systems? You need something incredibly strong, incredibly sharp, and positioned exactly right. Culin found his answer on the beaches of Normandy. When the Germans had prepared for the Allied invasion, they'd planted thousands of obstacles on the beaches. One of the most common was called a Czech hedgehog. 3 heavy steel beams welded together in the shape of a giant jack. Each beam was about 6 feet long and made of hardened steel. They were designed to stop tanks and landing craft from reaching the shore. They hadn't worked. The Allies had simply bypassed them or blown them up. Now they were just scrap metal scattered across the beach, worthless junk. Except to Curtis Culin, they were perfect. Steel that was already hardened, already shaped, already proven to withstand massive impacts. And there were thousands of them just sitting there waiting to be repurposed. Cullin's design was elegant. Take the Czech hedgehogs, cut them apart with an acetylene torch, trim the beams to about 4 feet long, sharpen the tips. Then weld 4 of these prongs to the front of a Sherman tank in a specific pattern, 2 on the bottom, angled slightly downward, 2 above them, all positioned to hit the base of a hedgerow. The physics were simple. 30 tons of tank, accelerating to full speed, driving 4 hardened steel spears into the base of an earthen wall. The prongs would dig in, create leverage, and literally rip the hedgerow apart from the inside out. The tank would plow through at ground level. The frontal armor, thick, nearly impenetrable, would always face forward. The Germans on the other side would never get their shot at the thin belly armor. It was brilliant. But would it actually work? Word spread fast. Within days, Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters arrived to see the hedgerow cutter for himself. He watched a demonstration. Then he did something that changed everything. He called General Omar Bradley. On July 14, 1944, Bradley himself came to see the modified tank. Bradley was the commander of the entire First Army, over 300,000 men. He was one of the most important generals in the European theater, and he was desperately looking for a solution to the bocage nightmare. They gave him the full demonstration. The modified Sherman charged a hedgerow, burst through, emerged on the other side with its armor intact. Bradley watched in silence. Then he turned to his staff officers. "How many of these can we make? And how fast?" The answer would determine the course of the Normandy campaign. But here's where we need to be honest about the numbers, because the legend says Eisenhower ordered 5,000 copies made immediately. That's not what happened. The American forces manufactured around 500 Culin Rhino devices. 500, not 5,000. That's still a massive undertaking. Welding modifications onto 500 tanks in just a few weeks. But it's nowhere near the mythical scale the story usually claims. Meanwhile, British forces were developing their own version, which they called prongs. They'd manufacture about 600 Mark I prongs, then 1,000 Mark II prongs and 500 Mark III prongs. Different design, same principle. By the time Operation Cobra was ready to launch in late July, about 60% of First Army tanks had some form of hedgerow cutter installed. That's 269 M4 Sherman tanks, 694 M5A1 light tanks, and 288 M10 tank destroyers. Not every tank. Not 5,000 tanks. But enough. Enough to change everything. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra. The breakout from Normandy. It started with the most massive aerial bombardment in history up to that point. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, hundreds of fighter bombers. They dropped thousands of tons of explosives on a narrow section of the German front line, trying to blast a hole that American armor could exploit. The bombing was devastating. It also killed over 100 American soldiers in friendly fire incidents when some bombs fell short. General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater, was killed by American bombs that day. But the bombing created the opening. And for the first time since D-Day, American tanks with hedgerow cutters could exploit it. V-Corps tanks equipped with the Culin Rhino charged forward. Instead of being stopped at every hedgerow they burst through, instead of exposing their bellies to German anti-tank fire, they kept their thick frontal armor facing forward. The German defensive line, so carefully prepared around the bocage, suddenly became irrelevant. Tank columns that would have taken hours to advance a single mile were now covering multiple miles per day. Fields that would have required separate battles could be crossed in minutes. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. They'd gotten used to hearing American tanks approach a hedgerow, waiting for the tank to tilt up and expose itself, and then destroying it with a single shot. It had become almost routine. Now American tanks were bursting through hedgerows without warning, emerging before the German anti-tank teams could react. The rules of warfare had changed overnight. By August 21, 1944, V Corps had linked up with British and Canadian units to encircle and capture 40,000 German soldiers in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The Normandy campaign, which had been stuck in brutal stalemate for weeks, suddenly became a war of maneuver again. The hedgerow cutter didn't single-handedly win the breakout. The massive aerial bombardment helped. Superior Allied logistics helped. German exhaustion helped. But the ability of American tanks to finally move through the bocage, that was the key that unlocked everything else. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because not everyone agrees on how important the hedgerow cutter actually was. Military historian Stephen Zaloga, one of the world's leading experts on American armor, has argued that the devices were not as widely used as the legend would suggest, and not as effective as often believed. Zaloga points out that many tank crews removed the cutters after the bocage fighting ended. They added weight to the front of the tank, which affected handling. They could interfere with the main gun's depression in certain situations. And once American forces broke out of Normandy into more open terrain, the cutters became unnecessary. Other historians, like Max Hastings and Chester Wilmot, credit the invention with restoring battlefield maneuverability and enabling the breakout from Normandy. So who's right? Probably both of them. The hedgerow cutter wasn't a magical solution that won the war. It was a practical tool that solved a specific problem in a specific time and place. For the bocage fighting in June and July 1944, it was transformative. After that, its usefulness declined. But here's what we know for certain. General Bradley thought it was important enough to equip 60% of his armor with these devices. Eisenhower later called it one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. And the soldiers who actually fought in the bocage, the tank crews who'd watched their friends burn in tanks that couldn't cross hedgerows, they knew it mattered. Sometimes the ground level truth is more important than the academic debate. So what happened to Curtis Culin? On July 29, 1944, the 29-year-old sergeant was awarded the Legion of Merit. The citation praised his initiative, mechanical skill, and courage in developing a device that had materially contributed to the successful conclusion of the Normandy campaign. For a few weeks, Culin was famous. War correspondents interviewed him. Officers congratulated him. His name appeared in newspapers back home. And then he went back to war. Several months later, in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest battles in American history, Curtis Culin stepped on a landmine. He lost a leg. His war was over. He survived, but he'd carry that wound for the rest of his life. In 1945, after Germany surrendered, Culin returned home to the United States. He married Bernice Enright. They moved to New York City, where Culin took a job with Schenley Industries. He didn't talk much about the war. He didn't tell people about the hedgerow cutter. When friends or neighbors asked about his service, he'd deflect. I was a mechanic. Fixed tanks. Nothing exciting. He had a Legion of Merit. He had a design that changed the course of the Normandy campaign. He had every right to call himself a hero. But Curtis Culin just wanted to be a normal guy again. On November 20th, 1963, Curtis Grubb Culin III died in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. His obituary mentioned that he was a veteran and had worked in the liquor industry. It didn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most of his neighbors never knew that the quiet man who'd lived among them had changed the course of World War II. But the story doesn't end there. Because while Culin himself faded into obscurity, his invention lived on. In 1964, President Dwight D. Eisenhower appeared on CBS with Walter Cronkite. During the interview, Eisenhower told the story of the hedgerow cutter. He got some details wrong. By then the legend was already replacing the reality, but he remembered the core truth. A sergeant with no engineering degree had solved a problem that was killing American soldiers. It was, Eisenhower said, a stroke of genius. Military historians began studying the hedgerow cutter as an example of battlefield innovation. How do armies adapt to unexpected problems? How do good ideas emerge from the chaos of combat? The Culin Rhino became a case study. In military museums across America and Europe, you can still see preserved examples. Sherman tanks with crude steel prongs welded to their fronts. The plaques explain what they are, what they did, and occasionally mention the name Curtis Culin. The design itself influenced post-war tank development. Modern engineering vehicles often have similar plow-like attachments for breaching obstacles. The principle Culin discovered, use overwhelming force at ground level to maintain armor protection, became standard doctrine. But perhaps the most important legacy is the lesson about innovation. Itself, Curtis Culin wasn't special because he was a genius. He was special because he saw a problem. He thought about it differently than everyone else had, and he had the courage to test his idea even though it seemed crazy, and, this is crucial, he worked in an environment that gave him the chance to try. Captain Morrison could have said no when Culin asked for permission to build his prototype. General Bradley could have dismissed the invention as too crude, too simple, not engineered properly. But they didn't. They looked at the idea, not at who was suggesting it or how unconventional it seemed. That's the real lesson of the hedgerow cutter. Good ideas can come from anywhere. From sergeants and privates, not just generals and engineers. From mechanics and hillbillies, not just people with college degrees. The armies that win wars are the armies that listen to their soldiers. Let me leave you with one final thought. The story you usually hear about Curtis Culin is a lie. Not a malicious lie, but the kind of lie that history tells when it simplifies messy truth into clean narrative. One genius sergeant saves the entire D-Day invasion in 48 hours. The reality is more complicated. Multiple inventors working simultaneously. An idea that came from a joke by a Tennessee soldier named Roberts. Hundreds of devices, not thousands. A tool that was important but not magical. But you know what? The real story is better. Because the real story is about ordinary people solving extraordinary problems. It's about a mechanic who listened when someone made a joke and thought, wait, that could actually work. It's about officers who were willing to give a crazy idea a chance. It's about soldiers who tested an unproven modification in combat because they trusted the guy who built it. It's about an army that adapted, that learned, that gave its soldiers permission to think, and that, not any single invention, is why the Allies won World War II. Curtis Culin died in obscurity, his name forgotten by almost everyone except military historians. But somewhere in Normandy there's probably still a hedgerow with a gap in it, a gap that was made by 4 steel prongs welded to the front of a Sherman tank. That gap is his real monument. Not because he was a genius, but because he was brave enough to try. The end.